Welcome to our study of Journey Without Goal. And as always, kindly generate the motivation to study this for the purpose of addressing the absolutely key issue that afflicts everyone everywhere, which is this confusion that has created what we call samsara. So with the present study, we're addressing this. So studying the Buddhist teaching will give us a certainty about what we're doing with the practice. And again, with the practice, we'll have an intimate and direct experience of what the teaching is talking about. And we could very well say, anytime we pick up any teaching, it's relevant for really any aspect of ourselves. There's never ever anything in the Buddhist teaching that doesn't actually have a role in terms of our experience. Of course, there might be some particular teachings which might not appear to be applicable or relevant to us, but we'd be surprised. And so there's never really any time that studying the Dharma is something that is not relevant to us, and as such also not relevant to anything that applies everywhere. We should never ever get caught onto this sort of bandwagon that will say, oh, Buddhism, as it was the Tibetans have it, is a very cultural thing, and they do all these Tibetan cultural things. Yeah, we do cultural things too. And it's interesting that some of the cultural things that we find in other cultures actually also can be transferred to ours. So I think it's very valuable that we have sort of a universal appreciation for all the various aspects that we have in the Buddhist teaching as essentially skillful means to dealing with all aspects, and as such also relevant to addressing the suffering universally everywhere. So so that said, then looking at the present text, then here we have the Vajrayana, Venerable Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, together with Kyabje Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche, his teacher and close friend. So okay, now this one here is potentially gnarly in a modern context, because not only it talks about rebirth, but it also talks about the groundlessness that comes from passing on. And here we're going to have to take the sage's words for it. We might be suspicious of what they're saying. We might think they have an agenda. And I remember reading Caroline Rose-Gimian's description of the students' reaction when Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching the lower realms, the descriptions of the lower realms in Jewel Ornament of Liberation by Gampopa. Essentially, the students of the Vajrayana, they just wouldn't have it. This was, too medieval, too Euronymous Bosch. It was just too, and the perception, of course, is justified. In you could say the reaction our culture has had against some of the what is perceived as dogmas of the institutions that are then charged with being corrupt. So the understanding is you could say the reaction is understandable, but at the same time, sometimes it's good to listen to how others experience things, and we could find ourselves in the same place. So this is where maybe now there's a few decades that have passed. Buddhism has sort of gone through a process of maturation, and there's possibly more trust in the validity of what we encounter in the narratives of sages. Of course, narratives that run across the ordinary boundaries of life, birth and death, and so forth. And so the discussion around Pado might seem more credible now. But sometimes, yes, it's hard to imagine. we might just want to give some credence, some benefit of the doubt to what is described here. And of course, what happens when we're dying is that we lose all familiar reference points, the ones that are dearest to us in terms of friends, family, and so on, our situation, and also our body. So, of course, again, to assume that it's our body that's basic to our consciousness is rather a leap of faith, in that something that doesn't possess consciousness giving rise to consciousness is possibly a convenient but rather far-fetched assumption. And unfortunately, it runs really as a deeply entrenched dogma through the belief systems of the modern world, that once you're dead, you're dead. Once you're pronounced clinically dead, that's the end of a consciousness. And purely from a logical point of view, the Buddhists would be rather reluctant to buy into that. So that's where there's, despite what it appears like, there's a lot of faith involved in what we call so-called modern science. Consciousness is not really something that is tangible, and as such not really conditioned by the physical. It's a long discussion, or it's an important discussion, and it is basic to what we're saying here. It's a biggie. Anyway, what we are talking about then, which comes down from those that have memories of this and those who have the insight of what others are going through, is as follows. And this is where we are addressing the experience that lies inevitably up ahead of us. The black darkness of fear escorts me along. The fierce red wind of karma chases after me. Yama's hideous messengers beat and hack me. Thus I experience the unbearable suffering of the lower realms. Guru, think of me. Look upon me quickly with compassion. Grant your blessings so that I free myself from the chasms of the lower realms. Now, the bottom line here is that we can free ourselves. So we're not saying this situation is something that we can't get away from. Well, we talk about, what is it, death and taxes, and taxes could be horrific, but then again, if we're dealing with taxes, sort of, you could say in a straightforward way, it needn't be an issue. And as practitioners, if we deal with the situation that's preeminent in Buddhism, namely the condition of delusion, then something can be done. But without that, the natural condition of losing familiar ground is going to be far worse when we leave our body. So that's where there's fear. What is going to be driving us is our habitual patterns, karma. Nothing new. We can personify death in terms of yama, but we're really just talking about the phenomenology of death. And so, yes, it's unpleasant, it's frightening. There's a sense of being attacked, assaulted, and essentially it's an extremely uncomfortable situation. This is what we hear from those that we could presume would know. And so we, recognizing humbly that this is what we might be encountering, we supplicate the teacher. And again, I think, like I quoted last time from the foreword of Francesca Fremantle's translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where the Vajrayana says you cannot, the Guru can't save you, but he can instigate the possibility. And with that is that we're, as practitioners, there's continually invoking the principle of the teacher, not just in terms of someone out there as external to us, but as something that abides as our innate basic goodness. And so that's why we supplicate the teacher, that we may be inspired, there may be, on the basis of this devotion and the natural brilliance of compassion by this nature embodied as the teacher, we then invoke the teacher to connect with this that lies beyond the ordinary patterns that drive us into the lower realms. So we supplicate that we may be free from the chasms of the lower realms. So these are then the so having invoked then the lineage teachers, then we're engaging now, you could say, the vision, the perspectives that drive the path of liberation, which is understanding the ramifications of confusion and being quite honest with regards to where we are. We're going to also be looking at our own faults. Of course, when we enter the spiritual path, we might think we're going to reinvent ourselves and no longer be sort of, how do you say, burdened by our identity as confused persons. But we also need to take into considerations that we are that as well. So we'll look at that next time. And I think what I'll do then, when we finish the text, if we haven't completed this first section, the crying to the gurus from afar, then we'll simply just read through that until we complete it. Yeah. So now in this chapter, the Tantric Journey, we're looking a lot at we've looked at some of the paradoxes of taking a journey, of being someone, and what it means to be someone on the path, and what are the actual implications of existence. Some very big questions have come up, and of course we cannot grasp and objectify and seize any, you could say, truly inherently existing identity or any truly existing phenomena altogether. There's nevertheless the sense of a reality, there's a sense of our being. And so we have this paradox of there being something that we cannot grasp, but yet this is what is our experience. So in that sense, there is the conventional experience of us existing, but also with the added perspective that it's not something that we can grasp. There's nothing that can be, you could say, relied on in terms of our identity. So we have this situation of what Tongsi Rinpoche refers to: when we encounter the Buddhist teaching, we better get used to the sense of paradox. And here, within that, us wisening up to reality constitutes a journey. So we, particularly then, in the Tantric journey, there's very much a sense of relating to who we are. But then, like Trungpa says, it's a question of, are we going anywhere or what's happening? But undoubtedly, something is happening. We could maybe say that, like you were saying, we could talk about the journey, we're becoming more infantile or becoming older, but something is taking place. And the discussion will now continue also really in that sense of questioning the premises for this entire sense of journey. Trungpa just says, when we become a Buddhist, we become a refugee. We take the refuge vow and commit ourselves to the Buddhist path. We make the preliminary decision to call ourselves Buddhists. After that, we slowly begin to develop the confidence that we are not only working on ourselves, but that we can also work with others. Then we take another vow, called the Bodhisattva vow. As we progress further, we're ready to take Tantric transmission, or Abhisheka. We're still making a journey. We might feel that we're going backward or forward, but that is simply the play of emotions. If we feel we're becoming infantile, we are learning. If we think we are an insignificant old man, we're still learning. A learning process takes place constantly throughout the whole path. So I think this is familiar, and particularly Trungpa Rinpoche's then presentations of the three yanas. This is, of course, and that's universal to all of Buddhism, the foundational aspects of recognizing the nature of confusion and the need to find a refuge from that, the easing up and the beginning to trust in ourselves and others, and the willingness to share ourselves with the world, the falling away of a personal spiritual agenda, the relinquishing of nirvana, taking the bodhisattva vow, and then the process of abhisheka, where we're actually encouraged to fully embrace this uncontaminated basic goodness as our true nature, our sadhana, our deity, our mandala. So there's within this, then it's legitimate. Whatever is taking place is a legitimate part of the process. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, it would be very difficult to go through each of the tantric yanas in detail, since many of you are beginning practitioners. So I would like to take a more general approach in discussing the tantric journey. We could discuss the beginning, the middle, and the end of the path. That is Kriya Yoga, the first yana, Anuttara Tantra, the culmination of the first three, and Atiyana, the final yana. The main point is that the same psychological attitude permeates all the tantric yanas, the same continuity based on the non-existence of ego. There is continual sense of journey throughout the path. We have developed a sense of egolessness at the Hinayana level. We have understood the compassionate activities that might take place at the Mahayana level, and we're now approaching the Vajrayana level. There is the continuity of an inspired student who is well disciplined, highly inspired by working with others, and who now is coming to grips with reality properly and thoroughly. And again, why we refer to the Vajrayana as coming to grips with reality properly and thoroughly, because it's only really at the level of Vajrayana that we're fully free of any kind of spiritual reference points, even that of the logic of emptiness as we have it in the Mahayana. There's a complete embracing of our actual experience, but with the insight of egolessness. So that's where we say deity is this unity of, you could say, cognitive clarity that we of course experience, appearance, everything that you can say, all the stuff of the phenomenal world, including ourselves, and yet the lack of inherent existence within that egolessness. So it's only at the tantric level that we, Trungpa Rinpoche says something, says elsewhere, that we're actually fully getting rid of theism. Until that point, we're still holding on to some reference points. And the tantric journey is actually fully integrating all our, you could say, perceptions and experiences without resorting to, you could say, philosophy or spiritual reference points. It's the full embracing of our experience, but with that insight, the insight of egolessness. The first tantric yana is Kriya Yoga. Kriya literally means action. So Kriya Yoga is the yoga of action. The basic approach of Kriya Yoga is that of purity or cleanliness, which in this case means understanding reality from the sharpest possible perspective, the clearest possible point of view. In order to see the Vajra world, or the tantric world, properly and clearly, we have to see it in a highly purified way. Otherwise, rather than creating the clear vision of Kriya Yoga, we will begin to fixate on spots of dirt all over the place. Actions such as vegetarianism, taking baths frequently, and leading a very pure life are recommended in Kriya Yoga, but they are by no means trips. Because before we begin such actions, we already have been trained. We already have been educated in the Hinayana and Mahayana. Therefore, we are able to practice the disciplines of Kriya Yoga properly. We are not just presented with Kriya Yoga suddenly out of nowhere, as though your mother decided to wean us by abruptly taking away her nipples. So we are not thrown into what we could say a very advanced practice, which Vajrayana is, and then also Kriya Yoga, as much as this is the first of the Vajrayana yanas. This is nevertheless an extremely sophisticated place of recognizing innate purity. And so the discipline that comes with that celebrates this purity, but at that point we are not attached. This doesn't become a cause of spiritual materialism. We're not fascinated, and we're also not consolidating our ego, or we're not patching up over our insecurity by taking on a role that we feel conforms with what we imagine would be spirituality, such as vegetarianism, such as bathing and cleanliness and so forth. And these, of course, it's easy enough to identify as trips, but there's also a place where this actually comes out of a genuine foundation and training. Vegetarianism can come from a completely non-spiritual materialist place. It can come from a genuine place. Similarly, also bathing and so forth, the lifestyle that we talk about in Kriya Yoga. One of the basic notions of Kriya Yoga is that there is both purity and dirt in emotions. Initially, emotions occur in a spontaneous way. Then we interpret those spontaneous emotions to our advantage. Having done so, we begin to possess our emotions as territory. We have our logic and our arguments, and other people's interpretations seem illogical or unreasonable. We feel that our emotional approach is accurate because we feel it. We feel that we're experiencing our emotions properly and thoroughly. So we begin to take pride in our emotions. And finally, we begin to find ourselves so righteous that it's upsetting. We are extraordinarily passionate, proud, jealous, and justified because we have worked out our logic completely. But that process is problematic. At the beginner's level, we experience pure emotion, but then we dilute it. We try to control it. In the end, we find ourselves swimming in a pool of sewage, which is extraordinarily irritating, to say the least, and somewhat hellish, in fact. You know, I should make a disclaimer here. Of course, when you're hearing me present Trungpa Rinpoche's text, my main motivation is actually to make you read the text and say, hey, there's a wonderful text. It's called Journey Without Goal. Read it. What you get when I'm going through it, and I sometimes, of course, I don't throw in this disclaimer every 2 minutes, but it's obviously, this is my personal interpretation, the inspiration I get from it. Some of it's not thought through, it just comes as we're reading the text. This is, you could say, shared with my own journey and the instructions, the 5th instructions I've received from other teachers as well, such as Kyabje Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche, Dinjon Rinpoche, Tukupen Wangyal, Tsongsa Jaman Khyentse Rinpoche, and so on. So, you know, a lot of the vocabulary and the sort of the presentations that I come, they, you know, you might have very well have all the students of Trungpa Rinpoche who would say, hey, wait a minute, no, Trungpa Rinpoche actually, when he was talking about that, he meant something else. And that I certainly would right away say, I bow to that. And so you should know that obviously, and like I said, this is only too obvious, you're getting just essentially, remember Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche once said, you know, that he couldn't pretend to be teaching the Buddhist teaching. What you could say he was offering about himself, he was saying, is just like if something had been subjected to a radiation, then it would be interesting to see, oh, what does it come out like, this thing that has been exposed to radiation? You know, this plant has been exposed to radiation. So similarly also, what you're getting here is just, this is what I'm saying about this. This is me exposed to the radiation of the Buddhist teaching in combination with Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings here. So, you know, there's every reason to be very critical about this. And that, in fact, would be a good thing, because that hopefully will make you read the book and also consult senior students of Trungpa Rinpoche. So what you have here is some Danish man who studied Buddhism for a while, and then his interpretations of Trungpa Rinpoche's sublime teachings. So, so here we are, and we are talking about emotions. And of course, what very often happens is that emotions, they are picked up and they become our feeling. And sometimes we seem to have a remarkable respect for emotions, when in fact they're just projections, they're constructions on the basis of our particular accumulated habitual outlook and so forth. We sometimes distinguish, of course, this is a little bit sort of, I don't know if it's coming up in this context, but we would particularly in Vajrayana, we talk about the difference between karmic prana and jnana prana, or wisdom prana. And so sometimes, we have this sense that, oh, I had this indication that tells me what's going to come next, premonition, and that could be true. That does happen. It particularly happens, of course, with less confused individuals. And if you look in the Vidyadhara's work on karma, the future is open, he talks about tendril, dependent origination, as we can actually read signs. The less confused we are, the more we can say you can read the truth of our phenomenal world. But short of that, then very often what we are doing is actually assessing our emotions as some sort of righteous insight about our reality. And this is what we need to be careful about. So of course we have all these various emotions that happen, and that's predictable. And of course, within the approach of Kriya Yoga, we're not all of a sudden going to be a transformed, pure person. We're going to have the same old. But the thing is, we're relating to it fully, directly, as practitioners of meditation. So we're not latching onto it. And that's where the phenomena of what we have in the Vajrayana, of taking, let's say, emotions and our phenomena onto the path, that we should be very suspicious about. We should be very skeptical about that possibility. It has to come from a completely egoless, or certainly we're aiming for it to be an egoless process, which is founded on the discipline of meditation, of touch and go, that we're aware that this arises, but we also let it go, so that we don't find ourselves beginning to be fascinated with our own, like Trungpa Rinpoche says, sewage, which is not going to be helpful. Okay. The Vajramala, a text on Kriya Yoga, talks a great deal about working with the emotions. According to the Vajramala and its commentaries, Kriya Yoga separates emotions into two types, pure and impure. Pure emotion, which is the original flash of instantaneous experience, could be called wisdom, which is jnana in Sanskrit, or yeshe in Tibetan. With that first flash, we experience the emotions properly and thoroughly, without preconceptions. At that level, emotion is insight. Then our emotions begin to deteriorate, and we begin to dilute them. They become ordinary passion, ordinary aggression, and ordinary ignorance. At that point, they are regarded as dirty or impurity. So again, this is where to enter into the Vajrayana without having a proper foundation in sitting practice, where we've learned to not be fascinated by the thoughts, simply just appreciate the clarity of the thought that arises, and to then just not fixated on it. That training is indispensable. And this is also where, as someone who's been exposed to some of the, you could say, quote unquote, higher teachings, it's only too clear that when Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching what appeared to be the basic sitting practice, he was introducing Vajrayana. We could even say he was introducing Ati from the start. And there's, of course, many of the older students, they will confirm this. But this is where such an exposure to proper sitting practice, and particularly I would recommend the way that Trungpa Rinpoche taught it. And myself, actually, I was first taught sitting meditation by a student of Trungpa Rinpoche in 1976. So that's really been a very important part of my journey in terms of understanding meditation, and it's remained always the core, really. And that's where this kind of training is indispensable. And particularly, we can see how sometimes being exposed to a lot of ritual and a lot of doing things actually leaves us without a proper foundation in this essential exercise, in this essential method of dealing with what arises in our mind. And that's where we could miss out if we don't have that training. So I warmly recommend to practice the sort of the fifth instructions from Trungpa Rinpoche on sitting practice, and it's in there then that we be very clear what we're talking about here, that there's thoughts that arise and we can be clear on what's happening. We know they're there and we don't attach ourselves to them. Whereas when we don't have that awareness, and this is where we actually need to have some exposure to actually sitting, so that we have a actual the framework to actually directly experience it. That when we have that, then we begin to see there's a difference between just thoughts arising, and they're not necessarily anything that carries, well, they could be emotions or whatever, but they don't necessarily in and of themselves constitute dirt. But when we begin to elaborate, fixate, ruminate, and sort of spiral down with these fixations, then it is that we perpetuate this second kind of emotion, which is then where emotions turn into this dirt or impurity. Trungpa says there is a definite division of experience into black and white in Kriya Yoga. The first impulse is regarded as purity, the true experience of reality in its fullest sense. Then we begin to water it down and mask that experience with all kinds of interpretations in an attempt to possess it. In doing so, the emotion becomes a confused one. So there is direct experience and there is neurotic overlay, both happening at once. That original purity is Vajra nature, which is inherently pure and cannot be contaminated. It cannot be destroyed at all. It is fundamental toughness. The moon might be behind the cloud, but the moon itself is still pure. The cloud is the problem. If we sweep away the cloud, the moon is sure to be a good moon. So we're talking about Buddha nature, and we're talking about the manifestations of this Buddha nature. That when it's, you could say, diminished, corrupted by grasping, yes, then we have the dirt. But in and of itself, it's a good moon. One should see the neuroses clearly, look at them and study them, and finally flush them down the toilet. The way to do that is through various purification ceremonies and visualization practices. Purification in Kriya Yoga is a very personal experience, but solving our neurotic problems is not the point at all. Purification is learning to relate with the problems. Does a problem exist or not? Is the problem a problem, or is the problem a promise? We're not talking about how to get rid of problems or impurities here, as though we were suddenly surrounded by piles of garbage that we want to clean up. That is not the point. The point is to discover the quality of garbageness. Before we dispose of our garbage, first we have to examine it. If we approach purification as simply trying to get rid of our garbage, we could do a great job of emitting spiritual pollution into the atmosphere. So again, this is where we shouldn't confuse the spiritual path with therapy, or the way that we would sort of be relating to our problems in the context of analysis, maybe, and so on. There's not like, here I am and I am the problem. It's rather going beyond an assumption around what is there. And so we're not changing the stuff, we're changing the way that we're seeing it. And this is not by just thinking positively, but it actually comes from looking at it fully, properly. Having related, Trungpa Rinpoche continues then with our garbage, the question of how we can purify ourselves is a question of surrendering. But all kinds of tricks are possible in this approach as well. We might say, if I accept the whole thing and regard it as no big deal, then will I be free of any problems? Those little tricks of ego, overlapping tricks of all kind, go on constantly. The idea is to surrender completely. So we might have still ego, still not really the, you could say, surrendering to the process, but the sort of the convenience of, well, why don't I just, regard it as that everything's fine, if someone could tell me I'm good as I am, oh, then everything's all right. Or if I pat myself on my shoulders, I hug myself and say, I'm okay, it's all good. Then there's a sense that, okay, well, I've all of a sudden accepted what there is. But it doesn't really get to the bottom of the actual conundrum, the actual place of the insecurity. It's really just pandering to the insecurity. And we haven't actually opened up to the possibility of reality of being good enough as it is. We're still struggling with this poverty. So that's where the taking refuge and surrendering entirely to the vision of the path is essential. Trungpa then says the visualizations of Kriya Yoga are highly developed. They are very transparent visualizations rather than simply imagining that we are a great guy or thinking of ourselves as a good person. In Kriya Yoga, visualization is identifying with our inherently pure psychological state of being, the part of us that is inherently innocent. So this is where we noted before, right? There's this part where everything that manifests within us in the first instance is completely uncorrupted. It's only later with the overlay and the, you could say, elaborations that things get corrupted. There's the dimension itself, which is of course what we call Buddha nature or basic goodness. That abides innately as the truest dimension of what we are, as uncorrupted. And this is where we invoke this in terms of deity. The deities are visualized in the name of our innocence or through the experience of our innocence. That innocent quality or pure aspect of our being is seen as a deity, as the embodiment of living enlightenment. So again, this is so important in Vajrayana culture that we perfectly understand deity as vipassana, as wisdom, as Buddha nature, as the unity of appearance and emptiness. And there's never ever a notion of deity as being something that might pander to our insecurity, that might be based on wanting to have something more than just, you could say, the naked experience of meditation, that we want to bring in some entertainment and so on, which is a very common understanding that permeates religious studies, anthropology, and you could say the popular imagination around Vajrayana. And that's where we need to raise the level of sophistication somewhat and be clear on deity in the Vajrayana is exactly what we're talking about here, our inherent innocence, our experience of innocence, not just theoretical, but actually experience. And that's where this needs to come about on the basis of empowerment from our teachers. But there's never ever a notion that it's something external. It is what Trungpa then says here, the embodiment of living enlightenment, not just theoretical enlightenment, but the actual experience. So Kriya Yoga's approach to life is segregation. Certain parts of our life is good and pure, and certain parts of our life and our experience are impure, that is, diluted and contaminated by egocentricity. In Kriya Yoga, we take the attitude that we're going to experience things very clearly and properly. We're not purely trying to relate with some abstract divinity or deity, but we're willing to relate with real experience. So this comes back then to us embracing the purity that abides within. We're aware that there's a fair amount of confused phenomena, but we're not overwhelmed by it. And our sadhana focuses on then you could say, undiluted, the non-ignorant, the actual reality of our purity. And we integrate that not as theory or philosophy or just something that is sort of underpinning our practice of vipassana, but really as something that permeates all aspects of our experience. So, so this is then Kriya Yoga, and we're going to look at Anuttara Yoga. So like Trungpa says, we're going to look at the first jhana, Kriya Yoga. We have 6 tantric yanas, what we call Kriya, Upa, and Yoga, and then Maha, Anu, and Ati. And the first one refers to as the outer tantras. And the outer tantras, the extension of the outer tantras is what we then call the Anuttara Yoga Tantra. And this is then, you could say, the culmination of the first outer 3. Sometimes, and this is where it can get a bit confusing, we also refer to Anuttara Yoga as, in fact, referring to all of the inner yogas. But for the time being, let's just consider that Anuttara Yoga is then it's the culmination of the outer tantras. Actually, Trungpa is going to explain all of that here. So I'll leave that to him. See if there's any questions. Good morning, La. When Trungpa says that in the Kriya Yoga, there is both purity and dirt, what does it mean in this level we are still operating on a dualistic level, grasping and rejecting? If not, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that as much as we might be dualistic creatures, we only have the term dualistic from the point of view that we know it's dualistic. There's more than that. So we all along the path in the Buddhist teaching, we operate with the vision that our condition as samsaric beings is curable. And that means that our nature innately is pure. We temporarily are stuck to some extent. And that's where you could say the different yanas, they deal with this stuckness in different ways. But the bottom line is, according to the third noble truth, the truth of cessation, this condition of being a samsaric being, of suffering in samsara on the basis of our confusion, that's a curable condition. So presently we have a condition within ourselves that fundamentally is pure. And when we're practicing meditation, then as we see how impulse and thoughts and emotion arise, then we identify here, and that's what Trungpa was talking about, how the first moment of an emotion actually is just, you could say, a spark. It actually lifts us. Just like, for example, if we're sitting and all of a sudden something's itching, that itching actually makes us a little bit more present, a little bit more awake. And any perception actually can sort of lift us a little bit, comes with a little a micro moment of adrenaline. And that's where the first moment of any perception really could be seen as pure, as just the natural spark of our basic ground. So that's seen as purity. But of course, what happens is that we elaborate on that. But with the practice of meditation, we are trained to elaborate less. Yeah. Okay. Do we live enlightenment only by seeing ourselves as deity? We can't only see as space? That's a good question. Suppose we could, but the thing is, don't you have a body? And don't you speak? Don't you have a phenomenal world? What is the nature of that phenomenal world? What is the nature of our reality? Space? Yeah, that's true. But nevertheless, we still find ourselves as relating to, you could say, adorned space. And that is where we speak about deity. And also in terms of our actually living experience, our sense of identity, there's a place where actually we're lifted. Sometimes if you're physically well, there's a sense of actually a sort of a confidence in our basic disposition that you could say reflects an innate confidence. And that's where you could say deity corresponds to that. The physical form of the deity corresponds to that. And similarly also with the energy of our body, mantra corresponds to that. So integrating what we call the innate 3 Vajras, as we do it in Vajrayana, as deity and mandala, is really just fully inhabiting space. It enables us to appreciate space more. So it's not as if we're stuck with this practice. I have to do visualization practice because that's what my teacher told me, and then I can get on to, the real thing. Not at all. There's a sense that everything we're doing with the development stage is an expression. expresses the realization, the experience of space, of reality. So it's a brilliant way where again, this is where you can say appearance and emptiness are completely integrated. So there's a question, is it correct that the stage of Kriya Yoga is only opened after we have sufficiently studied and practiced the previous stages of Hinayana and Mahayana? Is that correct? Yes. That's how we understand the logic of the path. But the logic of the path doesn't always correspond to what's actually happening, because we might, this is due to our particular karma, we might stumble across Vajrayana right from the start. That's where, of course, that's also where you can see the beauty of the Vajrayana teaching as it's transmitted, particularly in the living lineages of practice, continually refers to the Hinayana and Mahayana perspectives. So it's not as if you come across the living traditions of Vajrayana and that is where your path begins, that you're then not going to be exposed to the Hinayana and the Mahayana. We also would say this might be previous lives, accumulation of merit that has prompted you there. But so yes, that happens. That said, then Trungpa and increasingly many teachers who teach in the modern world, they see how important it is to have these foundational aspects in place, that before you do all the visualization practices, all the yoga practices and so on, that there's a proper training in grounding oneself in the Hinayana and the Mahayana. Feel free to ask questions. We still have 10 minutes. Very happy with these questions, actually. Yeah. What are we doing with deity practice? That's very important. And the whole notion of purity and impurity. How essential is the Tonglen practice? Very, very essential. And it's almost as if there's hardly any practices. There's hardly any practices that were presented in the there's hardly any of the practices that were presented in the context of, say, the tantric preliminaries that actually do include, particularly in the Nyingma practice, Tonglen is part of the what we call the bodhicitta. A little bit different between Kaji and the Nyingma Mundo there. Bodhicitta is a section unto itself in the Nyingma Mundo. And in there you practice Tonglen. And in these, if you look at how the teaching has been communicated, particularly from the Tibetan teachers, there's hardly any of it that isn't actually part of, you could say, a unified culture. So it's an absolutely indispensable part of the journey to practice Tonglen, even if you are practicing a Vajrayana. It's like if you have a car, you need to have a spare tire, or even more essential than that, there's no it's all part of the car, So Tonglen practice is extremely important, and the whole approach of the what we call relative bodhicitta, the bodhicitta of aspiration and application, and the Lojong practice is essential to approaching the Vajrayana. It is what provides really the spirit of the Vajrayana, which is compassion, being there for sentient beings, manifesting for sentient beings. So Tonglen is such an essential practice. Will you speak more on first moment? Well, first moment is the brilliant fact that we are continually giving rise to phenomena. In the Vajrayana, we would say everything arises really as a display of the compassionate display of this innate disposition of Buddha nature. So the first moment that arises when we're at any given moment really is simply display. And it's on the basis of that then that we can fall into duality, or we can integrate as practitioners or yogis, we integrate this as this purity, you could say the display of wisdom. Do many people practice Kriya Yoga? I have seldom heard of anyone doing Kriya Yoga. Well, that's true. I think it's somewhere the Vijayadhara speaks about how in Tibet they didn't do that a whole lot, and that's certainly also my observation. Like Kriya Yoga in the sense of vegetarianism and you know, taking baths, obviously, dressing in white and so on, is very much borrowed from the Brahmin tradition of India, where undoubtedly it was practiced much more widely. But the transmissions still continue, and to some extent, you have Tibetan vegetarians, and you have a sense of purity, very much also around, you could say, shrine culture and sacred culture. There is very much the notion of keeping things clean and clear, and you can also see this actually reflected in some of the behavior of some great yogis. Very, very clear ways of relating with reality in terms of cause and effect. So while you don't have the sort of the culture that we're talking about here that openly practiced in Tibet, then it is implicit. And by the way, also deity practices such as Tara and Manjushri and so on, they are very often by nature, you could say, the deities that are not in Yab-yum are very often actually part of Kriya Yoga. It's so difficult to stay with intense emotions without trying to solve them or elaborate, especially negative ones. What would you recommend? Okay, meditation. But of course, you're right. It is difficult, but that's the thing. We're dealing with the big issue, which is the very headquarters, the bias, the very core where our confusion takes place. So it's difficult, but it's also essential that we do it. And that's where we need really the framework of meditation. And then when we have that, then it's easier to integrate that that clarity that is not entangled when we elaborate on negative emotions. When with a foundation of meditation, it becomes easier to integrate that in our ordinary moving about. But it is difficult, and it's a good thing to recognize that it's difficult. It's also a good thing to recognize that it's doable, that it's something that can be done. It's not that difficult either, but it does require that we actually provide the framework to actually personally find out what works for us. Definitely meditation works for us, and also there might also be, you could say, post-meditation practices that also work for us. So yes, without trying to solve any of these things, but simply just approaching this as a meditator, it's doable. And we need to find out what works for us, but definitely meditation practice is essential in that process. Not quite related, but to what we did today, but started listening to Chronicles and Rinpoche when talking about 5 skandhas. Started with bewilderment as the ground for them, or the first one, form. I understood him. If I understood him well, can you maybe clarify a bit about this? Well, bewilderment is the initial moment where you could say the separation between Buddhas and sentient beings, and that's where Buddhas, or we would say the Buddha Samantabhadra, is liberated when this first, you could say what we talked about, the first moment, that when appearances arise, knowing this is just, you could say, display, is free, is not taking this display as external, and is not prompting this to, you could say, retreat into a notion of I and other. And that's where sentient beings, they do that. They begin to think in terms of I and other, and that's where the first skandha form takes place. If you look in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, there's a chapter called The Development of Ego that describes this very beautifully. Would you call this display the view in view, meditation, action? That understanding of what is taking place is part of what we call view. So for us to have an understanding of what's taking place with ourselves in terms of what drives our confusion and what informs our path of freedom, to actually have an understanding, to have the map, that's what we call the view. And so you can say everything that leads us to understand what's happening with us and what we need to do, that is what we call the view. And this we do on the basis of hearing the teaching, thinking critically about it, and then applying it. So rather we would say the view is where we hear the teachings, we understand how it fits with us through critical thinking and seeing how it applies with ourselves. And then we integrate this through meditation and action. So view is a rather big, you could say, the big picture, and meditation and action is the integration of that. It's so hard for me to construct these visualizations, so hard. I really can't. There is no way. There is not a chance in another way. Well, I think there's visualization that happens all the time. We're visualizing all the time. But if we think of visualization as something that's like, it's just like that, and that's unfortunately sometimes, you could say, in the translation process, then sometimes some teachers might make it sound more difficult than it is. But for example, can you remember what your mother looks like? Because when you do, you're actually visualizing. Can you remember what your front door looks like? You're visualizing. So we continue to operate within our mind, clear images. And we also similarly can understand ourselves, in terms of particular forms. But just looking at, okay, you look at a tanka, and there is actually a projection from that deity. There's actually a projection of something uplifted. And that corresponds really to the quality of the ground, the uncorrupted ground. So just go gently. Have a look at, so if you, visualization is very helpful. But of course, we need to sort of get over the panic a little bit. If somebody says you need to visualize every little detail, then it's a little bit intimidating. So that's where, play with it, let it be for a bit, then come back, make acquaintance with it, find the way in, I often find deity practice routine and when I'm not drifting and lost. Occasionally I'm softer in my approach and I feel more connected to the teacher and lineage. Why is that softer approach more effective? What makes a soft heart better? Well, I think you're onto it. Look, this is very good. And what you're describing here is a process. So you are actually, what you're describing here is just, what is it that works? And you can, without having to, I don't need to make a sales pitch for the soft heart. Obviously, that's bodhicitta and so on. So there's what you're describing here is a very good process that is aware of what's going on and what works and what doesn't. So that's just clearly something is working. What makes us soft-hearted? Well, familiarizing ourselves with it. So that's what you could say meditation is. It's familiarizing ourselves with what we have discovered that is working. Is first moment same as Dio? Does it happen in the sixth consciousness? Dio? I'm not sure what Dio means. Is that Dio mio, or is it Tibetan? His first moment, same as Dio. Does it happen? It happened in sixth consciousness. Yeah, it happens in sixth consciousness. Yeah. It is that thought that comes up, and that then we can objectify through the knowing of the thought. And then that very often is where it takes us into the perception of the sixth consciousness. So when we're talking about the dhatus, then there is of course the object, which is the first thought, then the noticing that, which is the faculty, the mental faculty, and then there's the consciousness that arises from that. And so all of that can take place within an instant, but it's when it doesn't, and that can't be helped. You know, we see something, there will be, or think of something, that's natural, that can't be helped, but it's when we don't elaborate, when we don't sort of spin off in distraction. So this first moment happens inevitably, but it's about us not then getting absorbed by it and distracted by it. The ground, its nature is pure, and how long it will take to purify the clouds. It loose that some clouds disappear, and then many others come. Well, we're not really worried about the presence or absence of the clouds. Of course, Trungpa was talking about how the good old moon is there behind the clouds, and it's about us seeing it. And sometimes we will see it, and sometimes we just know it's there. But we don't really break down if the clouds happen to be covering the moon. And we don't really worry about the natural display that will happen for us. We have karma, we have all sorts of things. That's inevitable. Again, it's not about making them go away. We really just we acknowledge that the moon is behind the clouds, and as we are practicing, then it would almost be strange if there wasn't things that arise. But what we're doing is we're shifting the way that we're relating to this. And this is only on the basis of actually meditation practice that we begin to have this sense that it's not a problem when the clouds arise, or when you could say display arises. So we're making friends with it. We're friends with those clouds. We're not fixating on them. We're acknowledging that they're there, but we're not battling with them. The funniest description of visualization I heard was, she's having a Jimi Hendrix experience. Some can do visions and some can't. Then being told the act is remembering was far more useful. Yeah, you know, we could think of, well, I don't know what exactly is meant here, but it sounds like we might think of visualization as some sort of psychedelic experience or process, which is not. I'm sure that the Vijayadhara would agree with. Visualization is very much kitchen sink. It's very domestic, but it's discovering the luminous quality of what is there, and that's what visualization brings about. It is us beginning to relate with our reality without the overlay of our projections. And that's where we acknowledge the purity that exists in our perceptions, the purity that exists within ourselves, and that is the good old moon. That despite what we might project onto the phenomenal world, and despite what we might project onto ourselves, the uncontaminated purity is still there. And that's what we are sort of connecting with through visualization, through visualizing deity, mandala, and so on. So that might be, this is where sometimes, I mean, there's some funny interpretations out there, that's for sure. Yeah. Okay. And like I said, this is just, what you're hearing here is just my understanding. Okay. Through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. in the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection. May they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you. See you again soon.